little bit away. We took the position that social systems do not make problems. See, basically, that's what this theory says, that a social system makes a problem. That if the family is doing its job, you wouldn't have a problem. If the family is not doing its job, the family, a social system, then makes a problem. And we decided to reverse that and say that systems don't make problems, problems make systems. It's the other way around. And what do we mean by that? Problems make systems. What we mean by that is that problems don't exist as a phenomenon of social structure. Problems exist as a phenomenon of understanding in language. And that a problem is not a defect in a social system. A problem is nothing other than what people say it is. A problem exists if you say, I have a problem. If you don't say that, you don't have one. Problems exist simply in language. They exist in language because they mean that there's something going on that we don't like, we label it a problem, and we try to make it different. Now, obviously, if we succeed in making it different, then we don't have a problem anymore. But if, despite our efforts at making it different, it continues, then we have a problem, simply because we say it is. Now, that may sound kind of funny to people that are not used to this way of thinking, but let me suggest to you that it is not sufficient to be treated just because you're psychotic. To be treated, you have to be a problem to somebody. Just to be crazy is not enough. We elect in my country crazy people to high office. You don't get locked up in the state hospital in America unless you're doing something that's bothering somebody else. You've got to be a concern to somebody. You've got to be doing something that alarms somebody. And I think it's true here also. You've got to be considered by somebody else as dangerous. You've got to be doing things that other people don't like. Like you've got to be violent with your children, or sexually abusing them. Or you've got to be not behaving in school. Or you've got to be doing something which alarms, concerns, and is labeled as a problem by somebody else to be treated. And it's true, I think, the world over, that problems are problems because somebody says they're a problem. That's why problems keep changing over time. That's why problems of sexual abuse used not to be a problem, now they are. They'll be a different problem 50 years from now, because how we describe them as problems will change. As our values, as our thoughts, as our understanding changes. A problem to be a problem has to be identified as a problem by somebody who has the capacity to make it a problem. Now, you can by law empower people, socially empower people to say this is a problem, so you can set up people and say this one's crazy and this one isn't. And you can invoke the courts to enforce that. But then even sometimes that doesn't work too well. I don't know, is that gentleman down at Osgood still there? Erklid, is that his name? Erklid? What did he say? The man in Oslo who won't leave the hospital until they tell him he's not violent. What's his name? Yukper, yeah. Now there's a good example of a real disagreement about whether there's a problem or not, which is usually the case with problems. But I think it exemplifies exactly what I'm talking about. So we say that problems don't exist in systems, problems exist in language. Problems exist because we say they exist. Problems are things that we want different, and we don't know what we want different until we say it. That problems exist in language, not in social systems. And that the membership of a problem system is not defined by some arbitrary external social structure. It's defined by those people that are in active languaging about a problem. And that's not necessarily limited to a family or to a psychic system. That a problem, the membership of a problem system, composes all of those people that are actively talking about the problem, and therefore defining the problem, creating the problem, and maintaining the problem. And that includes us as therapists. The minute you start talking with somebody about a problem, you have become a member, from this theoretical perspective, of the problem system, which puts a very different kind of responsibility on us than in the Parsonian model. And we can get into talking about that difference in terms of what we can do and what we can't do. But the minute you get into language about a problem, you have become part of the problem system. This means that the problem then, the problem system, is not defined by the individual, which is individual psychology. It's not defined by the family, which is family psychology. It's not defined by the community of the state, which would be more like a social theory, like Marxist or something else. A problem is defined by those people that are in active communication about what a problem is. And that might be one person talking to himself. It might be part of a family. It might be the whole family. It might be the family and a bunch of people from the community. Now, those of you that are in child and adolescent psychiatry know that full well. There are many a time you're working with somebody and you know that the teacher and the social worker and the community and the policeman are as actively involved in the problem as the family you're working with. And that in order for the problem to disappear, are in chronic treatment failures. There's a whole army of professionals that are active members of the problem system. Go on. And to do something about the problem, you've got to have communicative contact with whoever is involved in actively maintaining the problem through language. That you can't define a problem system simply on the basis of some pre-existing, predetermined social structure, whether that be individual or family or community. You can only define the problem system on the basis of those that are in active communicative exchange about what the problem is, whoever that might be. That means the system can be made up of one person. It can be made up of two persons. It can be made up of a whole family. It can be made up of a family and 15 social agencies. It can be made up of an accidental relationship that occurred just spontaneously at the moment. And that our job as therapists is to determine what is the problem system that we need to be working with. And that has to be determined separately for each and every problem. Now, it's not surprising that most of the time the people that get into difficulty with each other happen to be living together, because you don't do much communicating with too many other people, do you? Freud one time was asked what the mark of a healthy personality is, how he would define a healthy personality. And Freud thought for a moment, and much to the questioner's surprise, Freud simply said, Lieben und arbeiten, loving and working. And if you can love and you can work, you're healthy. And of course, by implication, he was saying that most of what we do in life is loving and working. If you're lucky, you can do them both together. And that's very true. We tend to get into problems with those people we love with and work with, and very few others, because you're not in active communicative exchange with others. And I think Freud would have been absolutely 100% correct if he had said Lieben, Arbeiten und Sprechen. Because it's not a problem unless you're talking about it too.
William Reich said low work and knowledge.
Huh?
William Reich said low work and knowledge.
Yeah.
So it had a kind of language aspect.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, same concept, I believe.
Do you limit that language to active speak, or can other forms of communication also create problem?
I would use the word language rather broadly to refer to any kind of communicative exchange, symbolic communicative exchange.
So if you, like you took the example yesterday about dull priest, so if you fell asleep and started to snore, then it's a better way to say you're not amusing than to say it by language.
Any kind of symbolic exchange. That's part of language here. There are some tricks to that you got to be careful of. Sometimes I think we sometimes mistakenly assume that nonverbal language is more powerfully expressive. I think we tend to ignore how expressive language really is. I'm talking about now about words. Words are the way we really deal with each other. We tend to discount that. But words are the way we rub each other, the way we hit each other. We do things to each other with words. Words are the way we really perturb each other's system. We wouldn't love the way we love had we not talked about it the way we talk about it. And we wouldn't hate the way we hate had we not talked about it the way we talk about it. Although I define it broadly, I still am very impressed with the power of language as words. But I wouldn't want to limit it to that, you're absolutely right. And any kind of symbolic exchange. It can be in music, it can be in mathematics, these are all forms of language. And it can be in the general communicative context in which we do things.
I have a few comments on your theory of problems as language. Would you say that the problems in Bronx or in Afghanistan or Nicaragua are language problems? That's the first question. And the second question is, I have a few friends who have been molested, and I even have a couple of friends who have been schizophrenic, and I think they would disagree strongly with you.
Probably.
To be schizophrenic, it would be like hell.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I didn't say that just because they're in language they're mild or minor. We can give each other unscripted hell in language.
Yeah. Okay, but your theory sounds like, say, Albert Ellis. And how are you going to make a demarcation between more objective problems, see, economic problems, social problems, real mental health problems, and language self-concept problems?
Clearly, you have a notion that there is a real reality which I don't have, and so we couldn't settle this between us.
Okay, let's discuss the poverty problem. Is it real or is it imaginary?
Well, I see, but you're making an assumption there that just because it's in language, it's imaginary. I don't make that assumption. The reality we live in is in language, and that's real. That's the only reality we have.
Language problem.
Yeah, and it's the only reality. It is as real as anything can be.
Yeah, that's okay. I agree with you. Is it a language problem?
Yeah.
Only.
Yeah. It's a problem because we describe it as such. Yeah.
But if you have been molested, is that also a language problem and only a language problem?
Yeah.
So if you are thinking otherwise, saying other things to yourself, then the problem might disappear.
It might or it might not. Just because it's in language doesn't mean that it will disappear.
To me, it seems as if you are sort of confusing two levels. One thing, I think there is sort of problems, and what you are talking about, to me, seems more the process of describing this problem in language. Say the process of making these or some of these problems official. I think sexual abuse could be an example of that. I think sexual abuse was a problem for the child, say 100, 200, 300 years ago, but no one discussed it. No one talked about it. And now we're talking about it.
Our attitudes towards children have changed radically over the last several hundred years. Whether it's a problem or not depends on how you want to describe it. And you know, you're making assumptions that I simply don't agree with. And that's a perfectly valid position you have. As a matter of fact, it's the prevailing position, that their problems are real and that all we're talking about is description. No, reality is very hard, and language is the only tool through which we deal with it. And it does hurt, and it does destroy people, and it's very powerful. I would agree with that.
Yes, you correct me if I'm wrong. You define a problem as a sort of awareness in the cognitive system. You describe a problem, and then it's a problem.
It's not totally cognitive. We haven't been able to go into this much, but it's more intersubjective than cognitive. I have some disagreement with cognitive psychology on this.
I have a question. What about then the feeling systems? You can feel that something is wrong, but you cannot describe it in words. You have a sense that something is wrong. So shouldn't also
that happens to be in language, you know. Hmm? You're now using words.
Yes, but isn't there a phase in the definition of a problem that is pre-verbal?
I don't think so.
Ah.
I know that, again, is a fairly traditional point of view that many people disagree with. I disagree with that. That you don't simply know what anything is until you say it.
But still you can feel awful, you can feel irritated, you can feel depressed, you can have a sort of feeling that something is wrong, but you can't say what is wrong.
You may have problems putting it into a language which is acceptable to you, but you don't have any sense of anything being wrong unless you put it in language.
There is a disagreement then, because I think that, to me, my experience is that there is a problem before a problem is defined in words.
Yeah, I think not.
I feel that we have not made clear what we mean about language yet.
Right.
There's something there. But what I wanted to ask you about, you said a person is a problem or has a problem when somebody else defines his
There's somebody else can be
behavior.
yourself, too.
Could be yourself, yeah. That's what I want.
Because you do talk to yourself.
It is hard for me to explain what I mean, but I'll try.
Sure.
To me, it is when I feel unrestful or something like that. I feel it is something wrong, difficult, problematic, but I don't really know how to speak about it or what it is. Then it is really a problem to me. When I can speak about it, it isn't so much of a problem as when I can't. So I just wonder what you call that phenomenon.
I'm still not sure what your question is.
You didn't.
Say that again?
I mean, if I can put words to my feelings, then it isn't so much of a problem as when I can't. So I just wonder what you would call that phenomenon. Phenomena.
I think you need to, at least I need to, begin to make a distinction between, I think in traditional psychology we have a strong sense that there are feelings, and feelings exist by themselves independent of cognitive activity. Basically, traditional psychology thinks of there being three areas of human function. You have cognitive function, you have feeling function, and you have behavior. And that these are independent realms, basically. And I simply don't believe that. that you cannot have feelings without an understanding what a feeling is. Now, your understanding may not be satisfactory, it may not be workable, it may not be complete, it may be different, it may be deviant, but there is no feeling without language. I don't think. Because the minute you say, I feel as if something is wrong, it is now in language. To that point in time, there's nothing wrong. And a feeling that you may have that something is wrong may be because you think that somebody that's important to you is ignoring you, and they may say to you in language, I'm not ignoring you, I'm just preoccupied because my father just died. And then you say, oh good, then I don't have that feeling anymore. That's all in language. I don't think that you can separate these functions. I think indeed we do have excitabilities in the way we think about things, and feelings and thoughts and action, as far as I'm concerned, are a unitary whole. And of course we behave and think with feelings. And sometimes we behave and think with feelings that change. But I see them as units that are synthetic wholes rather than being separate functions. Is that? Answer your question? Yeah.
I don't know whether I agree with you.
Oh, that's okay. If you agreed with me immediately, I would wonder where I went wrong. Yeah.
I got problems.
Okay.
Understanding what you're saying.
Yeah.
But for instance, take a baby crying, and you don't know what is crying. If it's the basic needs that is unsatisfied, or whether something is brings into safety in or something. And how will you then take out the sentence problems existing in language? Is the crying? That's in
Even that's in language.
Mm-hmm.
That's in language too.
Yes, but
And it's only important to you if you happen to want to not let babies cry. I happen to not like them crying either, and so I try to figure out an understanding that will cease the crying. But that's in language, and that happens to be a position that I hold, and something I believe in, and I have ethics and values and other things too. But the baby does not know it's got a pin in it.
yeah. So it's just
There is no knowledge without language.
and you can't identify what is the problem. So it's just thinking that something is wrong.
Now, you're assuming that baby crying and problem are the same thing.
Well, it might be a problem that the baby is crying, yes.
No, you're making an assumption. It may be a problem to you that the baby's crying, but it is not a problem to the baby. And you will deal with that problem as you've defined it in the language of understanding that you use. And you will do what's necessary for you to do to appease that understanding. But the baby does not know it has a pin in it.
Now, I'm aware that the problem exists in language then.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I find that your view is very much like George Herbert Mead, what he describes in Myself and Society,
Yeah.
where he says that there is no consciousness without language.
That's right. Absolutely.
And,
I would agree with Mead on that, yeah. Yeah, and I think there are alternative sociologic theories to Parsons. But I think our psychological theories in the field of therapy are more Parsonian than from Mead. Absolutely. Now, this business of language may, and no, there's a lot that can be said about this, and when we can go into a tremendous dialogue on language and what we mean by language, which might be necessary. But let me just say from a practical point of view that what I'm saying is not that surprising to most therapists. Therapy is a process that takes place in language. Therapy is the talking cure. And most therapists try in some form or fashion to influence the languaged understanding of events and the people they're working with. And they do this vis-a-vis language. One of the characteristics of experienced therapists is they tend to talk more like each other than they do the training they had. Because they've learned in working with people that you talk the language of the people you're working with. And you use the understandings in language of the people you're working with in order to be able to work with them. Most experienced therapists know this intuitively and do it intuitively. There was a very famous study done at the University of Chicago, not famous, not so famous, as a matter of fact, a very important study done at the University of Chicago back in 1949. This young graduate student did a dissertation. And I think it was a woman, but I'm not sure. But what she did was she took a group of therapists that had been trained in one of the different training institutes at Chicago. And Chicago was very rich at that time. They had people that were trained in psychoanalytic institutes and Adlerian institutes and Rogerian institutes, and so they came from different theoretical perspectives. And what this young psychologist did was to have these different therapists that were schooled in these different training institutes respond to a series of clinical vignettes. And what she had these different therapists do was to say, you know, if the patient said this, I would do this, or I'd understand it this way, and they did a very complicated analysis of all of that, and she discovered something. She discovered that people trained in the Freudian Psychoanalytic Institute tended to answer the questions and see the patient production in terms of the Freudian theory. And the people trained in the Rogerian Institute tended to answer those vignettes in terms of the Rogerian theory. And so they described the problems differently across these different institutes in terms of the institute of origin, where they were trained. But she discovered that that similarity held only for the first 5 years. That if you took therapists that had been trained in the first 5 years of their graduation, they tended to do it like each other. The people trained just like them. But if you took people that were out 10 or 15 years post-training, they tended to answer things more like each other, independent of where they were trained. How do you understand that? I understand that as a process of beginning to learn through experience, of being in language with the people you're working with, and not to be too influenced by understanding it from a particular theoretical perspective, which is a form of language that our patients teach us not to use. Yeah.
A few years ago, there was published another study which shows the opposite. What you say is true, I guess, but the other study showed that clients lend their language from the therapist.
Oh, yeah.
So if you go into psychoanalysis, you use that kind of language, and if you are choose an Adlerian therapist or a behaviorist therapist, you understand the problems and the world in those.
I have no problem with that. As a matter of fact, I agree with that. That we teach our patients the language to use in order to be able to talk with them. That's absolutely true. Most of the initial phase of therapy that we engage in is an attempt to school patients to use the language that we understand. And for instance, a particular Freudian therapist will teach people how to understand their problems through the medium of dream association and dream analysis. And it takes 6 or 8 months to teach people to do that. It's a very time-consuming procedure. But we teach people the way we talk about problems, the way we understand problems, the way we respond to problems. We teach them to use our language. That's absolutely true. It's interesting that a person being analyzed by a Freudian never produces a Jungian dream. The analysand of the Jungian never produces a Freudian dream. They're too well schooled. So I agree with that. But I don't see that as contradictory.
What is it?
I just said that if you take those very same therapists and you give them 15 or 20 years of experience, they tend to begin talking more like each other than they do the original training they received. Didn't say they were identical. I said they begin to talk more like each other.
When they are talking to their clients or when they are talking to each other?
Probably both. Probably both. What time do we break for dinner?
We have the break in 5 minutes.
5 minutes, good. Oh, sorry.
I wonder what the word problem means to you. How would you define it?
Problem for me?
Yeah.
Now, let me also say this. I'm talking now about a theoretical position which I find useful in psychotherapy. I would apply this to trying to deal with large-scale problems like the inability of the Russians to produce wheat, the revolution going on in Afghanistan. I'm really not sure. At this point in my thinking, I'm describing some issues and ways of understanding which I find useful for dealing with those kinds of problems that we would ordinarily think would yield to whatever we think psychotherapy is. I do think there's a connection, but I'm not a social theorist and don't know how to deal with major economic problems. Had very little experience with that. I would define within this more limited framework, I would define a problem as something that somebody is doing. Saying, thinking, feeling, acting, and that somebody can be yourself, that alarms you. And in that alarm, you're trying to modify or change that behavior, and despite your best efforts, it's not changing. That's the problem. That's how I'm defining it. In other words, I'm doing something, or one of my family's doing something, or my colleague is doing something that I have alarmed objection about, and I'm busy trying to change, and it's not changing. And it's got to have all of those elements to be a problem. Because obviously if my kid is behaving in a way that I don't like, and I'm alarmed about it, and I do something and it changes, then I'm no longer alarmed. People don't come to therapy then. They come to therapy when what they're trying to do isn't working. Is that? And obviously, what I'm alarmed about will vary tremendously. For instance, you described schizophrenia as a very painful experience, and I'm sure indeed it is. There are situations, however, it's considered to be a very benighted and somewhat angelic and saintly experience, and in those instances, I'm sure it is. And that's all in language.
Yeah, but the point is, in our society and in our culture, I think it is mainly negative.
Well, we tend in language to have certain universal values and meanings that we attribute to language. This is what we call culture. And therefore we tend to shape experiences in a certain way through our language about them. And then with schizophrenia I have some notions anyhow. And this gets away from the thrust of this. I would find it very hard to talk about something as vague and undefinable as schizophrenia anyhow. I doubt seriously that there is an entity, schizophrenia, that it is a multiplicity and range of things, and that we make a very bad mistake by assuming that there is a schizophrenia, which is a mistake in language.
Yes, and in clinical practice.
Yeah. Okay. That people that are in agony with each other around alarm and trying to do something about it with each other have a problem system, and that's not necessarily just the family. And that for that problem to disappear, people have got to change their minds about what the problem is. They've got to talk about it differently, which is exactly how you measure outcome in therapy. Do they see things the same way? Do they describe them the same way, or don't they? And I'm sure all of us have had the experience in working with somebody. For instance, let's take the case of child abuse, where you work with a family that have been accused of abusing their child, and you got the family and the child and the therapist here, and the social agency that made the referral. and you work with this family and you say, boy, they're doing great, they're past this problem, they're doing real fine, but the social worker says, hell no. You've not seen them at home, you don't know what's going on. You have not worked with the whole problem system. And unless the whole problem system changes in its language, its understanding, the meaning attributed to the nature of the problem still exists. And I don't think anybody in this room has not had an experience somewhat similar to that. You get into the same conflict across wards, where you have the mediotherapist saying this is a terrible problem, and the therapist saying my patient needs to go home for a family visit, and the mediotherapist is saying no, they can't. You have not worked with the entire problem system. The whole problem system has got to shift in its language about a problem in order for a problem to no longer exist. What this does is it defines problems not as things we fix, it defines problems as things that dissolve. And they dissolve through different language. It's a very different role for us as therapists. It also has another implication which I think is of the utmost importance. It means that every problem and the diagnosis of every problem and the membership of every problem system is totally unique to that problem. That there are no communalities across problems. That makes our job even more difficult.